Okay, so the presidency, right? The third branch of the government. So we covered Congress last week. We're doing the presidency today. Next week we will talk about the Supreme Court. So now we're covering the branches. Okay, so the presidency was established in Article 2 of the Constitution with the creation of the executive branch. It wasn't a very smooth process. Some of the founding fathers wanted a collective executive, and some of them wanted one single leader. And obviously there's advantages to a single leader in you don't have to make decisions by committee, and there's more stability. So that argument won out in the end. There was also a fight over how the president would be chosen. Some wanted the president directly elected by us. Some said let Congress choose the president. And the Electoral College was supposed to be the compromise. Keeping in mind, of course, all of the issues we see with the Electoral College. And of course, originally, the presidential candidates were chosen first by the members of Congress at a party convention, then by the states, and now, of course, by us. So that's actually been the process for only about 50, 60 years. It hasn't been that long that we've directly nominated the president. It used to be the party leadership would say, your nominee is Harry Truman, go vote for him. So that's a relatively new phenomenon. The president gets his powers through basically 3 different types of powers. The expressed powers are the ones given directly to him in the Constitution. So this includes making treaties, commander-in-chief of the military, pardoning, and so on. These are the powers that the president is given in the Constitution. So the only way these powers could be changed is through a constitutional amendment. So the presidents have had certain expressed powers from the very beginning. Over time, the president has been given the ability to use what's called implied powers. And this comes from the necessary and proper clause, that the president shall do whatever is necessary and proper for the country. So these are considered necessary for the president to be able to exercise his powers. An example of this is that the president has the express power to appoint a cabinet official. He doesn't have the express power to remove one. So in 1926, in Myers v. the United States, the Supreme Court said the president has the implied power to remove a cabinet official without needing permission from Congress. So this is why President Trump could ask former Attorney General Jeff Sessions to step down, or Defense Department. So it's through implied powers that the president can say, I'm not happy with your performance, I want someone else. And then the president can ask that person to resign or fire them if they refuse. Usually they choose to resign. There's also delegated powers. This is where constitutional powers given to one branch is exercised by a different branch. We see this happening with the legislative branch. Congress will pass a law, then give responsibility for this law to the executive branch. So Congress passed the Clean Air Act in the early 1970s and gave control of it to the Environmental Protection Agency. The clean air, clean water, those belong to the Environmental Protection Agency. No Child Left Behind. Control over that was given to the Education Department. The Affordable Care Act. They let the president decide how that was going to be implemented. Congress will pass a bill, then they'll say to the executive branch, all right, now it's up to you to put this into place, to take responsibility for this. You can't enforce it. You can't. Also Congress's way of getting revenge sometimes and saying, okay, you wanted it so badly, now it's yours. Have fun with it. Okay, so in terms of breaking down the expressed powers, which again are the ones given to the president in the Constitution. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He is also the formal head of the CIA, National Security Council, NSA, and the FBI. Keep in mind, of course, you're going to have someone who is considered the head of each agency for the day-to-day business. Constitutionally, the president oversees military and national intelligence. What this means is in his capacity as president, he can choose to deploy federal troops to the states, send the National Guard out. Now, usually a state legislature will ask for help. They'll ask the president to send troops to help. But if it's a clear crisis, the president doesn't have a permission. We saw this happening when President Eisenhower declared martial law in the city of Little Rock and enforced desegregation. He said, if you're not going to do it, I'll make you. So he sent in the military and sent a warning to the South, you can do this the nice way or you can do it the hard way. And then he had President Bush sending 22,000 National Guard troops to New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina, helping with the rescue efforts, trying to stop looting, and so on. So if it's a clear crisis, the president doesn't have to wait for a state to request help. He can just send the National Guard in. This can lead to backlash. When President Trump tried to send federal troops to Oregon, that didn't go over very well. But usually, if it's something like a major natural disaster or huge protests, they will ask for help, and the president will send personnel as needed. In all likelihood, the National Guard will be deployed to the major cities no matter who wins the election tonight. They also have the power to grant a reprieve, pardon, or an amnesty. So the president can choose to pardon people. President Andrew Johnson issued a pardon for people who participated in the Confederacy during the Civil War. President Carter granted a blanket amnesty to all of the draft dodgers in Vietnam. More controversially, President Ford chose to pardon former President Nixon not long after he resigned office due to Watergate. Pardons aren't necessarily controversial, although sometimes they can be. When President Obama pardoned Chelsea Manning, that didn't go over very well with the intelligence agencies. Usually they'll tend to pardon people convicted of non-violent drug offenses who probably shouldn't still be in jail. The president also has the power to make treaties, accept ambassadors, and recognize a country. In 2015, President Obama chose to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba, reopening the embassy, allowing for trade and travel to Cuba, which was rescinded by the Trump administration, but it was a kind of changing of the status quo. It can also choose to recognize newly independent countries. When South Sudan formally split off from the Republic of Sudan in 2011, we recognized them as a new country and accepted their ambassador. So we can recognize countries or not. The policy of the U.S. government after the communists took over in China was to recognize the government of Taiwan as the legitimate government until Nixon went to China in during the early 1970s and opened up diplomatic ties with China. So sometimes the president will choose to reach out to a country that we haven't had the best relationship with and try to fix the situation, try to restore diplomatic ties. And in the case of Cuba, it was clearly the case that boycotting Cuba because of communism for 50 years wasn't working. I mean, clearly it wasn't making a difference. So President Obama said, let's try to open up the doors for communication, maybe encourage democracy in a more gentle fashion, which in itself was a bit controversial, but it did normalize relations for a little. Okay, the president does have the ability to cite executive privilege. Any communication between the president and his staff or advisors is not to be revealed without the consent of the president. Okay, so Jose, your question was, can a president override or nullify a presidential pardon? No, they cannot. They cannot go back and rescind the pardon. Those are upheld. So no, they can't nullify or override a pardon. Good question, but no, they cannot. Okay, so the president has the right to say, look, we talked about this and the public doesn't need to know. Because the day-to-day discussions between the president and his staff isn't something we need to know. There's a lot of private information that just shouldn't be revealed. However, executive privilege does not exist if the president violates the law. So in U.S. v. Nixon, Congress subpoenaed the president and said, "We know that you've been secretly tape recording discussions in the Oval Office. Some of these discussions pertain to the Watergate break-in and other violations of the law, so turn over the tapes." He cited executive privilege and tried to say no, and the Supreme Court said, "You can't do that." If there's questions about the president possibly breaking the law, you cannot cite executive privilege and refuse to turn over information. Otherwise, it can stay with him. But if it's clear that the president might have broken the law, he's not going to get to cite executive privilege. The president, of course, also has the right to veto legislation. And we tend to see the use of the veto going up when there's a divided government. So, when George W. Bush was president, during the last 2 years of his office, Democrats controlled Congress, and he vetoed 10 bills during those 2 years. President Obama vetoed 12 bills in his last 2 years when Republicans controlled Congress. The use of the veto goes up if the president's from one party and Congress controls the other. Presidents have vetoed over 3,000 bills, and Congress has only overridden a veto 111 times. Given that they need a 2/3 majority in both chambers to override a veto, it's pretty rare. The presidents don't want to rely on the veto because then they're seen as weak. They don't want to veto too much legislation. Then they're seen as ineffective or unwilling to work with Congress. So they do try to limit the veto. And they will introduce a legislative agenda to Congress. Here's what I want to see in the budget. Here's the new policies I want to see. Can we work together on this? Now, obviously, this is more likely when the president and the majority of Congress is from the same party. And the president can choose to circumvent Congress by passing an executive order. It's a rule or regulation that has the effect of legislation but is not permanent. The executive order can be rescinded by the next president. It's a way of getting around Congress if they know Congress won't work on a certain issue. So in 2016, President Obama passed an executive order that would extend background checks for gun purchases and try to increase mental health services to reduce gun violence. He'd been president during some of the worst shootings, Sandy Hook, Pulse nightclub, San Bernardino. He wanted more money for mental health services. They knew he wasn't going to get it through Congress. So he issued the executive order, and President Trump came into office and rescinded his executive order. If the president knows Congress isn't going to work with him on an issue, he can choose to go around them. But it's not permanent like legislation. Okay, so in terms of things like delegated powers, Congress can choose to give responsibilities to the executive branch. And we saw this happening quite a bit during the New Deal. There were so many new programs created. Congress just couldn't take charge of all of them. So they went back to President Roosevelt and they said, "You created the programs, you figure out how to implement them." And so certain parts of the executive branch are created by Congress and controlled by Congress. The Department of Homeland Security was created by Congress in response to 9/11. The IRS, which frankly most of us don't like, doesn't have a lot of flexibility. They are given very strict guidelines for how they can act. So if you're like, "Hey, why can't you cut me a break?" and they're like, "We really can't," it's not them saying no, it's Congress saying no. If you don't like your taxes, well, that's on Congress. The IRS can only do so much. Then sometimes Congress doesn't really provide clear definitions and just leaves it up to the executive branch to figure out what to do. In 1972, they passed the Consumer Product Safety Act that was supposed to reduce the risk of the unreasonable risk of injury from household items. They didn't define what constituted an unreasonable risk or how to reduce it. That's why you get the warnings like, "Don't use a hairdryer in the bathtub," or "Don't drink bleach," because there aren't very clear guidelines on that. There is a famous example that does get misused. Have any of you heard of the famous McDonald's coffee lawsuit? Hot coffee lawsuit? Okay. So the way people understand it is that a woman was drinking coffee, it was too hot, and she won a couple $1,000,000. But that's not actually what happened. She got a cup of coffee from McDonald's, and she had it in her lap for a minute, and she turned the corner and the coffee spilled. It was so hot that she had third-degree burns on her legs and genitals. And so she went to McDonald's and she said, "This was way too hot. Will you pay my medical bills for me?" And they said no. So she had no choice but to sue them. And that's when she won a couple $1,000,000. Not because the coffee was too hot to drink, because it caused permanent bodily damage. So that's why coffee temperatures are now regulated. And also why it says caution, contents may be hot. Because no one should get a third-degree burn from coffee. That's ridiculous. It was bad. She was permanently injured. It was very bad. So things like that do need to be looked at. Do need to be taken very seriously. For the Affordable Care Act, because there was so much in it, most members of Congress didn't fully read the bill. They just looked at it and said, "Sounds good. Department of Health and Human Services, you tell us what we're going to do. Tell us how this is going to work. We pass the bill, you implement it." Which is partly why it took so damn long to get the Affordable Care website up and running. Was Health and Human Services had to figure out, how do we set up the market exchanges, get the website up and running, forms, new tax codes, all of that. So it took a while to implement it. Because Congress basically said, "Okay, yeah, this looks good. Now you figure out how to implement it." For the first few months it was up, the healthcare.gov website kept crashing. Millions of people were trying to get on it at the same time and they couldn't. So it took a while to work out the kinks in that particular system. Okay. In terms of the inherent powers, these are powers that are not explicitly granted by the Constitution, but are assumed to be presidential powers. For example, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. So President Lincoln used that power at the beginning of the Civil War to combine the various state militias into a 90-day national volunteer force, increase the size of the Army and the Navy, censor the mail, and suspend the right of habeas corpus in the border states. Congress retroactively approved all of them, saying that's part of his powers as president during a time crisis. As Commander-in-Chief, the President can deploy troops without a formal declaration of war from Congress. So the wars in Vietnam, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq were started prior to Congress authorizing the war. The President can't send troops abroad indefinitely without getting permission from Congress. So after the Vietnam War, when it became clear that the executive branch had lied to Congress about the start of the Vietnam War, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. The President has to let Congress know that he is sending troops abroad. After 60 days, if Congress has not authorized a mission or a war, the President has to bring the troops back home. We've had short military missions that weren't technically wars. When we went and invaded Grenada and Panama, we were in and out in less than 2 months, so Congress didn't have to authorize it, and the President just did what he needed to do. So, if it's a long-term war or a long-term action, Congress does have to approve it. Congress did approve the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It didn't take very long for Congress to authorize the war in Afghanistan post 9/11. The President also has some powers because of the Patriot Act in terms of increased surveillance by the NSA and other actors, and the creation of the new Department of Homeland Security. They took several different agencies and put them into Homeland Security, including Border Patrol, ICE, and others, FEMA, amongst others. The President was able to use his inherent powers to shut down all commercial flights on 9/11 for a couple of weeks after that. That's not a formal power, but obviously you don't want planes in the air, so no one was going to push back against that. All right, so the executive branch is more than just president. It's a variety of different offices and positions that are instrumental in helping the executive run. One of the most important institutions is the cabinet. Now, the cabinet does not exist in the Constitution. It's simply the reality of the bigger the government, the more oversight you need, the more cabinet positions you need. So cabinets could be consolidated, created, or deleted. That's why they were able to create the Department of Homeland Security, because there's no real restrictions on it in the Constitution. They are nominated by the President, and they do have to be confirmed by the Senate, the various secretaries. The secretaries of Education, Labor, Homeland Security, and so on, all have to be approved by Congress. They don't make decisions together. The Department of Agriculture isn't necessarily going to be talking to the Department of Energy unless there's some kind of overlap. They don't necessarily know each other. They only really meet up when there's a formal cabinet meeting. It's kind of hard for them to work together. They tend to just do their own thing and let Congress and the President know what to do. There's also the National Security Council. It's the main foreign policy advisory board that includes the President, Vice President, Secretaries of State, and Defense. They'll meet with the President and they'll tell him what's going on in various countries. They'll go around the room and they'll say, here's what's happening in Colombia, or Paraguay, or France, or China, or Rwanda. Because the President needs to know what's happening around the world to know how to respond. There's also a White House staff, about 450 analysts and advisors to the President. A lot of people who work in the White House do roll over from one administration to the next. Unless they directly work with the President, they're pretty much going to be moving from one administration to the next. If you're a low-level admin assistant, probably doesn't matter who's president, you're going to be staying there. There's also the executive branch, the executive office of the President, the permanent agencies that do various tasks for the President. This includes the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB as it's known, which prepares the budget, designs the President's program, reports on agency actions, and oversees proposals. So the budget is a top-down approach. The Office of Management and Budget talks to the various agencies and sets the term for negotiation. The EPA has to talk to the OMB and say, here's how much money we think we need. And then they say yes or no, and they negotiate. And that gets presented to Congress. So the OMB talks to the agencies, sets the amount and discussions, and then tells Congress, here's how much we're asking for. It's more of a top-down approach. Okay, vice presidency is important in terms of succession. Basically, the vice president is important for two reasons. One, if something happened to the president, he or she would take over. And two, to cast a tiebreaker vote in the Senate. If the Senate deadlocks 50-50, then the vice president breaks the tie. So it's not considered a very powerful position. One of FDR's vice presidents said being vice president wasn't worth a bucket of warm spit, which constitutionally speaking is kind of true. Where they come in handy is during the election cycle. They're there to help the person at the top of the ticket get elected, provide some kind of balance. Kennedy in 1960 was a Northern Catholic Irishman. Who does he pick? Johnson, a Southern, more moderate, well-liked Democrat. So it was because of Lyndon Johnson that Kennedy won. Johnson was able to bring the South on board with Kennedy. With Donald Trump, he wasn't doing very well with evangelicals. So he brings on Governor Mike Pence, who is an evangelical, and he gets the evangelicals on board with him. So if you've got someone from the north on the top of the ticket, you usually want someone on the south to balance the ticket. Older versus younger, experienced, not. White, not. They try to balance it out. It doesn't always work. It didn't work for Hillary Clinton in 2016. She made a very safe choice choosing a southern white male Democrat, but he didn't really bring anything to the ticket, and it didn't help her in the end. So sometimes it works, and sometimes it's just like, yeah, people don't get excited. The vice presidents can choose to shape their office. Dick Cheney has been one of the most powerful vice presidents in history. He helped shape the war on terror, push for the war in Iraq. So sometimes they can choose to flex their muscle a little bit more, try to get more involved in policy. Vice President Biden, towards his term, got involved in trying to speed up the process of clearing sexual assault cases. There's a statute of limitations in most states for rape cases, but if you were raped and 5 years later they still haven't tested your kit and the statute of limitations is up, what are you supposed to do with that? We're just pushing for more money to test the kits and clear the backlog. Sometimes they'll pick a policy and they'll kind of shape it on their own. Again, they're really important because of the 25th Amendment. 8 vice presidents in history have become president because of the death, or in one case, the resignation of the president. This was informally the rule until the 25th Amendment was passed in 1965. So when Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, and Johnson took the oath of office that same day, it wasn't established that that was the process. There was tradition, and he said we need to make this as clear as possible that there is someone in charge. He didn't even wait until he got back to Washington, D.C. He took the oath of office on Air Force One. Some people had a problem with that. Other people said we need to show that there's someone in charge and try to prevent chaos. It's now because of the 25th Amendment, the vice president will succeed the president should something happen to him. That's why if something happens, they tend to separate the president and the vice president. On 9/11, Dick Cheney was taken to a bunker while President Bush was coming back from Florida. They were not going to put them in the same room. They don't want to do that because you don't want to lose both of them at the time. When Kennedy was assassinated, Secret Service immediately surrounded Johnson, and they were like, you cannot go anywhere without us. So they don't let them stay together in case. Then we have the first spouse. Now, of course, we've only had first ladies, but I'm hopeful that'll change sometime soon. Not usually as heavily scrutinized as the president, because of course it's not a formal constitutional role. They're largely there to conduct White House tours, decorate the White House for the holidays, plant trees, meet with spouses, things like that. It's seen as a largely ceremonial, kind of decorative role. Now, some first ladies have said, yeah, that's a bunch of crap, I'm doing what I want. The two of the most active first ladies in our history include Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton. Eleanor Roosevelt was very active in promoting civil rights, getting the first woman appointed to a cabinet position, supporting the war effort in World War II, and after her husband died, being part of the group to create the United Nations and serving as one of our ambassadors to the UN. She was not content to sit on the sidelines. She was very, very active. Hillary Clinton tried to help get healthcare reform in 1993, 94. Didn't work out, but she also wasn't just going to sit on the sidelines. Melania Trump made history as our first foreign-born First Lady in almost 200 years. We almost had a first husband, but not yet. But I'm just trying to picture Bill Clinton doing a tour of the White House. I just don't think that would have been what he would have done, right? Yeah. Look at the new China pattern I picked out. Yeah, that's not happening. But Dr. Joe Biden, who's Joe Biden's wife, has said if he gets elected, she's still planning to teach because she's an English professor at a community college, and she said she still wants to teach, which actually would be kind of cool if she was still able to keep her job. So why not? Okay. So it's not enough for the president to have constitutional power. The president needs the public on his side. They try to expand their power through public mobilization, through reaching out to the public. So, of course, they have to campaign for office. They have to go to all these different states, go to a state fair, go to a diner, or show up at a college. They want the public to get on board with their agenda. Sending out surrogates, doing a national address, things like that. But the first president to really make good use of the media was FDR. Prior to FDR, people would really only see and hear the president if they went to see a movie and there's the newsreel before the movie. So FDR made use of the radio in what he called his fireside chats. He would go on the radio and talk about what the White House was doing in terms of the Great Depression and World War II. This was the first time the American people got to hear their president's voice on a regular basis. And people said it felt like you were sitting in the room with him. He was also the first president to hold a bi-weekly press conference, to address the press, announce policy, and so on. He was the first president to really recognize the power of the media and to use it to his advantage. It was because of him that we have those, usually, regular press conferences. We have the White House Communications Office that's in charge of crafting the president's message, talking about policy, answering questions, responding to negative news stories. That hasn't happened much in this administration. They haven't been holding regular conferences. That's unusual, but who knows what's going to happen after tonight, right? That might change, that might not. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady to do press conferences of her own. She required newspapers to send a female reporter to cover her press conferences, so she was also responsible for the mass hiring of women by the media. This was the first administration to really understand and appreciate the media. It was during the Obama administration We saw more use of the internet. The administration set up the We the People website where you could submit a petition. If it got 100,000 signatures, it would go to someone in the administration for review. He also used Facebook and Twitter. Apparently, Secret Service had to talk him into giving up his BlackBerry because he really didn't want to. He's a bit of a technophile. And of course, we've seen President Trump going on Twitter constantly, and the benefits and drawbacks of that. The reality is, for presidents, American people are fickle. Sometimes we love them, sometimes we're like, you suck. So popular support can rise and fall very quickly. So President Bush, right after 9/11, had something like a 90% approval rating. That's not sustainable, right? It's one thing if the president's standing at ground zero. It's another thing when he's back in the House. He had over 70% support for about a year after 9/11. Then, when the administration botched the response to Hurricane Katrina, his approval rating dropped to 39%. President Obama entered the White House with a 76% approval rating. That dropped to 36% in fall 2014 because of the government shutdowns and so on. And President Trump's approval ratings haven't gotten much over 46, 47%. He's never enjoyed a very high approval rating. Presidents have to keep in mind that public support comes and goes. One day they love you, the next day they're ready to storm the White House. It's just the reality of the job. They can't please everyone all of the time. There's a lot of different strategies they'll use to try and flex their muscle. They can use regulatory review to control an agency and make them implement new rules and regulations. President Obama pushed new regulations for overtime, making it easier for people to collect overtime rather than harder. New regulations on pollution. They got the Department of Education to crack down on predatory colleges like ITT Tech who are taking student loan money but not actually giving anyone a degree. So a lot of fraudulent colleges were shut down during the Obama administration. A lot of those for-profit state colleges got shut down, and good riddance on that one, because they were really bad. So sometimes they'll look at something and say, this has to be, this just isn't working. Again, they can issue an executive order. President Truman issued an executive order to desegregate the military. President Roosevelt instituted the legal, but yet upheld by the Supreme Court, internment of the Japanese Americans in World War II. And it was because of executive orders that President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, and President Theodore Roosevelt created the Food and Drug Administration. Have any of you read a book by Sinclair Lewis called The Jungle? Okay. The FDA is a direct result of that. Yeah. Yeah. Because it basically exposed how absolutely dirty, filthy, and disgusting our food processing facilities were. Yeah. It's because of that book that we have the FDA. That's why they keep an eye on food for like food contaminant poisoning, and also prescription drugs. For example, Prozac. When it first came out, everybody thought it was great. until they realized it could actually increase suicidal. So then they had to kind of take a look at that again. So it's there to help keep us from taking a drug that is really not good for us, or food that is beyond disgusting. Now, sometimes Congress will push back on an executive order, and it can be challenged in the Supreme Court. President Trump's first executive order with the Muslim ban was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. Once he fixed it and put it back in, it was then upheld by the courts. So if it goes too far, it can be challenged in federal courts, and the Supreme Court can overturn it. The president can also issue a signing statement. Basically, what happens here is they'll sign a law, but they'll say, I'm not enforcing this. This is not possible. So President Obama signed a bill that contains the provision that he had to notify Congress prior to transferring prisoners out of Guantanamo Bay, because he was trying to shut it down. And so the president signed the bill and he said, this provision's unconstitutional, I'm ignoring it. He's commander-in-chief and he can choose to say, we're taking people out of a military base. So technically, Congress didn't force him to do so, so he ignored it. The presidents can do that sometimes. They can say, I'm signing this law because it's important, but I disagree with this part, and this part. And again, executive orders are only enforceable as long as the president is in office. The so-called Muslim ban. If Joe Biden were to win tonight, he could choose to rescind that executive order. He could say, this, I don't agree with this, and he can take it out. It doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're targeting countries that have almost nothing to do with terrorism. Second of all, there's over 1 billion Muslims worldwide, and the majority of them are peaceful, law-abiding. Yeah, I mean, deciding that an entire religion is bad is just, yeah. Also, it's like, okay, so what's someone supposed to do if they left the country, now they're trying to get back in? Or you're trying to bring your family over, but now they're on the list and they can't come in. It doesn't make sense. The process to come into the U.S. is extensive. If you're a refugee in a camp in Kenya, you're waiting at least 2 years to come to the U.S. because you have to go through extensive background checks, fingerprinting, scans, etc. The odds that a terrorist would be able to slip in are pretty slim. We also tend to forget that perpetrators of 9/11 came here legally on a visa from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not on the list, so... Huh? Yeah. And oil. Weapons and oil, yeah. It's political. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Okay. Now, the president isn't a god, right? He can't do whatever he wants all of the time. If the president disagrees with Congress over the budget, then the government gets shut down. The president faces a lot of pressure to negotiate with Congress. At the end of 2018, when President Trump wanted more money for the wall in the budget and Congress said no, and the government shut down, people blamed the president. And they said, go to Congress and fix this. And the longer it went on, the worse his approval rating got until he finally had to give in. The president can't control the economy. The president can't do anything about a company going belly up. There's only so much control they have. They can talk to the Federal Reserve. They can try to bail out a company. It's not like President Obama Obama could do much about the fact that the housing market had collapsed. So unfortunately, we want the president to fix the economy, but there's only so much that he can do. There's only so much that they're allowed to do. Also, if it's a divided government, the president's not going to get done what he wants. President Obama couldn't get a Supreme Court justice after Scalia died because Republicans in the Senate said no. So the president can try to go against Congress, but most of the time Congress is going to win that fight. The president does have more power, more recognition than originally intended. The president wasn't supposed to be as strong as he is. Now, part of that is because of the remaking of the presidency by FDR. He really was our first modern president in a lot of ways. He was the president who said, I can try to fix the economy, I can pass new legislation, I can do this. The president wasn't supposed to be as strong as it is, but the reality is, over time, this just happened. I mean, if you look at the three branches, Congress was really designed in some ways to be the strongest. The president obviously has taken more of that power. Government executive branch agencies running a lot of policy, they've become a much stronger branch. So for better or worse, the president is what he is today. And we kind of just have to live with that. Although, of course, if the president abuses his powers, Congress can impeach and possibly remove him from office. Any questions, thoughts? Anyone have any predictions about tonight? No? Yeah. I think it's going to come down to a handful of states. Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and possibly Wisconsin. I don't think Texas is going to flip blue this election, but I do think it's going to be close. I think it's going to be closer than it's been in a long time. And I think that's going to open the door for some interesting discussion about what's going to happen. This state's becoming more purple. So in 4 years, we could be a battleground state, depending on what happens tonight. If somehow, I don't see it happening, but if somehow Biden actually wins Texas tonight, there's going to be a whole lot of rethinking going on about this. People are going to be going, what the hell just happened? Yeah, it could be interesting. And for Democrats, there's three things they want tonight. They want Joe Biden to be president. They want to keep control of the House, and they want to take control of the Senate. If all three of those things happened, we could have an effective government for a while. If that doesn't, we could still be in the same boat we are right now. So, I don't know. We'll see what happens tonight. I'm not convinced we'll know who won, but I could be wrong. I don't know. So if you haven't voted, please, 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 please go vote. Please go vote. If you go to vote and there is a line, stay in line. If you are in line, when the polls close, legally they have to let you vote. So if you go at, let's say, 6 o'clock and the polls close at 7 and you're still in line, they still have to let you vote, so don't leave. Don't leave. Stay put, okay? Yeah, if you haven't voted, please go vote. If we know who won, on Thursday we'll discuss the election. If it's still up in the air, then I'll do my lecture on the making of the modern presidency. So we'll have to see what happens. Either way, there's no reading for Thursday. Just I'm prepared to discuss the election or hear about how the presidency has been shaped over the last 70 years or so. And that's it for today. Oh, remember that your papers are due in a week by 11:59 p.m. If you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute.